This is our house now, old man. You're just a guest here. My son-in-law said that to my face. In the living room I'd painted myself, standing on the hardwood floor I'd laid plank by plank in 1994. He didn't even lower his voice. My daughter was sitting right there on the couch. She looked at her phone. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the city of Portland, Oregon. I know how things are built. I know how they hold weight. And I know exactly when a foundation has been compromised beyond repair. This is the story of how I found that out, and what I did about it. My name is Bernard Kowalski. I live, and have always lived, at 4112 Fairview Ridge Road, a house I bought in 1991 with my wife Elaine, God rest her, and finished paying for in 2009. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a workshop in the basement, and a backyard maple that drops leaves onto the neighbor's fence every October and has for 30 years. It's mine. The deed says so. The property tax bills come to me. The memories embedded in every wall belong to me. My daughter Sophie came home the winter of 2021 with 2 suitcases and a husband named Troy, and a story I'd heard 100 variations of in 67 years of living. His business had collapsed. They were behind on rent, just until they got back on their feet. Could they stay, just for a while, just through the spring maybe? Sophie was 34. She'd been my youngest. After her mother died in 2017, she'd become, for a time, the only family I spoke to regularly. So when she called crying from a gas station parking lot in Tacoma, I didn't hesitate. Come home, I told her. Stay as long as you need. I should tell you about Troy right away because he matters. Troy Weston, 38. Former owner of Weston Custom Cabinetry, LLC, which had gone under in 11 months due to, depending on who you asked, a slow market, bad partners, or poor decisions. Troy was the kind of man who filled a room with his opinions and left it with your patience. He had a handshake that was too firm, a laugh that was too loud, and a habit of explaining things to people who already understood them. When they moved in, he shook my hand at the door like we were closing a real estate deal. Bernard, you're a lifesaver. We'll be out of your hair before summer. That was February 2021. The first months were fine, or fine enough. Sophie cooked on Tuesdays. Troy fixed the garbage disposal when it started rattling. He insisted on doing it himself, then charged me $80 for the part, which I later found at Home Depot for $22. I filed that away, not out of bitterness. Out of habit. Engineers document things. By month 4, the dynamic had shifted. Small things at first. Troy rearranged the furniture in the living room because the layout, according to him, didn't optimize the space. My wife's reading chair, the green velvet one she'd had reupholstered twice, ended up in the corner behind the TV. Out of the way, he said. It's just cluttering the flow. I moved it back the next morning. He moved it again that afternoon. I let it go. I shouldn't have. By month 8, I was eating dinner in the kitchen while they watched television in what had always been the family room. Not because anyone told me to, because the gravitational pull of their presence had simply annexed the space. Troy would stretch out across the full couch. Sophie would tuck in beside him. There was no room that wasn't occupied by their assumption that it was theirs. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family helps family. I'd been telling myself a lot of things. The money started early. September 2021. 6 months in, Troy came to me with a stack of papers and a story about a vendor who was threatening collections on $28,000 in unpaid invoices from Weston Cabinetry. Bernard, if they file a claim, it'll destroy our credit. We'll never get back on our feet. We're so close. I wrote the check. I documented it. I kept the receipt. Then there was the lawyer. $6,500 to an attorney in Tacoma to handle the LLC dissolution. Then $4,200 for a used cargo van Troy was going to use to start a handyman business, a business that never materialized. Then $1,111 prime $100 here for car registration, $800 there for Sophie's dental work, $400 for a phone Troy said he needed for interviews. I kept every receipt in a manila folder labeled with the year and a tab marked Troy Sophie. 31 years in engineering. Documentation is not pessimism, it's foresight. By the time the second winter arrived, I had spent $47,600 in documented loans and an estimated $900 extra per month in utilities, groceries, and household expenses. They were still there. Let me tell you about the Thanksgiving that broke something in me. Not the thing that ended everything, but the thing that cracked it. I had cooked since 6 in the morning. The turkey, the stuffing, cranberry relish from scratch the way Elaine used to make it, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. I'd been at it for 5 hours. When I carried the bird to the table, Troy's brother Dale was already seated, along with Dale's girlfriend and 2 friends of theirs, whose names I was never told. Troy had invited 6 people to my house without mentioning it. I sat down at the head of my table. My table, the one Elaine and I had bought at an estate sale in 1998, refinished ourselves in the garage. And Troy said, "Actually, Bernard, would you mind sitting at the end? Dale's got a bad knee and needs to stretch out." I sat at the end. Dale did not appear to have a bad knee. I watched Troy carve the turkey I'd cooked. I watched him accept compliments for the meal. At some point, Sophie looked at me across the table, and something moved behind her eyes. Something like recognition. And then she looked away. After dinner, while I was washing dishes alone, I heard Troy in the living room telling Dale's girlfriend that he and Sophie were thinking about maybe doing some renovations on the place. Open up the kitchen, maybe put in a wet bar. My kitchen. I stood at the sink with my hands in the water, and I thought about what my father used to say. He was a machinist from Scranton, not a sentimental man. He said, "Son, once you let someone mistake your patience for permission, you've got a long road back." I started documenting differently after that, not just receipts. Dates, times, exact words. The way an engineer documents not just measurements, but tolerances. The day everything broke open was a Sunday in March, Easter Sunday. As it happened, I had bought a ham, glazed it the night before, gotten up early to finish it. Troy's parents were coming. I'd been told about this 3 days prior, not asked, told. His parents, Frank and Bay Weston, arrived at noon. I shook Frank's hand at my front door. He walked past me without making eye contact and said to Troy, "Nice place you two have here. Nice place you two have here." I went back to the kitchen. By the time we sat down, there were 9 people at my dining table. I was seated at the far end, near the kitchen door. Troy had placed himself at the head. My chair, the one with the slight wobble I'd always meant to fix, had been pushed against the wall to make room for a folding chair from the garage. When I came to the table and reached for my chair, Troy looked up. His expression was mild, almost bored. "Bernard, actually, would you mind eating in the kitchen? We're a little crowded, and it's really a family thing today." The room went very quiet. 9 people. His parents, his brother, his brother's girlfriend, 2 neighbors I'd never met, and Sophie. Every one of them was looking at something other than me. I stood there for a moment. I am not a man who raises his voice. I never have been. Elaine used to say, my greatest strength was that I thought before I spoke, and my greatest weakness was that I thought too long. She was right on both counts. I said quietly, "Troy, whose house is this?" He smiled. That particular smile I had been cataloging for 2 years, the one that managed to be condescending without technically being rude. "Bernard, today we're hosting. You're welcome to join us later for dessert if you'd like." I looked at Sophie. She was looking at the tablecloth. I turned and walked to my study. I sat down at my desk, the one I'd had since the 80s, the one where I'd graded Sophie's math homework when she was 11, where I'd written the eulogy for Elaine's funeral. I opened the bottom drawer, and I took out a folder. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. His name is Walter Grimes. I've known him since a property dispute in 2003, one of the best real estate attorneys in Multnomah County. He didn't answer on Easter Sunday. I left him a message. "Walter, it's Bernard Kowalski. I need to talk about a trespassing situation at my property. Monday morning, first thing, if you can." Then I walked back to the dining room. I stood in the doorway. I looked at Troy at the head of my table, at the 9 people eating the ham I had bought and glazed, at my daughter who would not meet my eyes, at Frank Weston who had called this place Troy's. I said calmly, and I want to emphasize this because people always ask, and the answer is yes. I was completely calm. I said, I want everyone who is not the owner of this property to finish eating, collect their belongings, and be gone in 1 hour. This is my house. I bought it in 1991. I am the sole owner. Troy, Sophie, you have until tomorrow morning. I'll have your locks changed by noon. Troy laughed. Actually laughed, the way you laugh when you think someone is joking. Bernard, sit down. You're making a scene. I looked at his parents. Frank Weston's face had gone the color of uncooked dough. I said, "This is not a scene. This is a statement of fact. You are guests in my home, and I am withdrawing my hospitality. That is my legal right." The silence that followed was the loudest I'd ever heard in that house. Dale's girlfriend whispered something. Troy said, "Dad, come on," to Sophie. Sophie said his name, just his name, Troy, in a voice I hadn't heard her use before, flat. Something in it that surprised even me. B. Weston gathered her purse. Frank followed. They were gone in 6 minutes. The neighbors left without speaking. Dale and his girlfriend took less than 4. And then it was just us. Troy stood up. His charm was gone. The smile was gone. What was left underneath was the thing I'd suspected for 2 years. He said, "You can't do this. We live here. We have rights. You can't just throw us out." I said, "You've been here 2 years and 2 months. You've signed nothing. You've paid nothing. You have no lease, no rental agreement, and no legal standing to remain on this property without my consent. I'm withdrawing my consent. I'm withdrawing my consent. You have until tomorrow at noon." He stepped toward me. He was bigger than me. He knew it. I picked up my phone. I dialed 9, then 1. I looked at him, then 1. The operator answered on the second ring. I told her my name and my address. I told her I was the owner of the property and that I had guests refusing to vacate after being asked to leave. I asked for an officer to assist. She told me someone would be there in about 15 minutes. Troy's face did something complicated. He turned to Sophie. She had her hands over her mouth. There were tears on her cheeks, not the manipulative kind. Or if they were, I couldn't tell anymore. Real grief looks like real grief. I've only ever seen it one way. An officer arrived. A young woman named Castillo who had clearly handled this type of situation before. She was professional and exact. She asked for my deed, which I had ready. She asked Troy for documentation of tenancy. He didn't have any. She explained to them, without drama, that they had been asked to leave by the property owner, that they had no documented tenancy rights, and that if they didn't leave voluntarily, she would have no choice but to assist with removal. Troy said he would call his own lawyer. Officer Castillo said that was absolutely his right, and that his lawyer could contact my attorney, and that in the meantime, they needed to vacate. They packed 2 bags each that night. Sophie came to the doorway of my study before they left. She looked at me for a long time. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. She closed the door softly behind her, which was somehow worse than a slam. I didn't sleep. Not from guilt. Or not only from guilt. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in over 2 years. And quiet, when you're not used to it, has a texture. Monday morning I met with Walter Grimes. I brought 2 folders, one with the property deed, one with every documented expense since February 2021. Walter is a careful man. He went through it page by page without expression. He said, "Bernard, you followed correct procedure. The officer's documentation will help. But I'd recommend we get ahead of this. Troy Weston doesn't seem like a man who accepts losing gracefully." I said, "He isn't." Walter said, "Then let's assume he'll file something. Adverse possession won't hold time, not even close to the threshold in Oregon. But he might try emotional distress, wrongful eviction, some kind of cohabitation claim. We need everything buttoned up." I told Walter something I hadn't told anyone since my retirement party in 2018. "Walter, I'm not on a fixed income." He looked up. "When I retired from the city, I also sold the consulting firm I'd built on the side. 22 years of structural consulting, private clients, commercial work. I'd incorporated in 1996 and sold the company in 2017, the year Elaine died. The sale came to $1.8 million. I'd invested quietly. I had resources. Walter sat back. He said, "Does Sophie know this?" "No." I wanted to know what I was worth to people without the money's influence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what did you learn?" "I learned the truth early," I told him, "which is its own kind of lucky." He prepared a full defense. I paid his retainer $12,000 without hesitating. 3 weeks later, a process server appeared at my door. Troy had filed a civil complaint in Multnomah County Circuit Court. He was claiming constructive tenancy, 2 years of continuous residence, and seeking $35,000 in damages for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. I called Walter. He said, "Good. Let them make their case first." I sat on my back porch that evening with my neighbor Reg, a retired high school principal who'd lived 3 houses down for 25 years. We'd been playing chess on alternating Thursdays since 2009. He came over when he saw my light on. He said, "I saw the papers." I said, "Word travels." He said, "You doing all right?" I said, "I'm doing fine. I'm doing what needs to be done." He moved a pawn. I moved my knight. We sat in the spring cold and drank coffee and didn't need to say much else. The court hearing was on a Tuesday in May. Multnomah County Courthouse, downtown Portland. I wore the gray suit I'd worn to close the consulting firm's sale. Walter met me in the lobby. Troy and Sophie arrived together. Troy in a sport coat that was slightly too small. Sophie in a blue dress I recognized from 3 years ago. Their attorney was a young woman named Fitzgerald Crane, who carried too many folders and kept dropping her pen. The judge was a man named Alderman Boyce, 60 years old, steel gray hair, the expression of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by human behavior. He reviewed the complaint in about 4 minutes. Then he looked at Troy's attorney. He said, "Counsel, your clients are claiming constructive tenancy based on 2 years and 2 months of continuous occupancy. Oregon requires 10 years minimum for adverse possession. You're aware of this." She was aware of this. He said, "And for a wrongful eviction claim, I'd need to see evidence of a legal tenancy agreement. Do you have one?" She did not have one. Walter presented my documentation methodically, every expense, every date, every email, including one Sophie had sent in September 2022 thanking me for, and I quote, "letting us stay at your house while we get back on our feet." Her words, on record. The judge looked at that document for a long time. Motion to dismiss, granted. Case dismissed with prejudice. It took 11 minutes. In the hallway outside, Troy started toward me. Walter stepped in front of him without theatrics. He said simply, "Don't." Troy said something about how this wasn't over. Walter handed him a business card and suggested he have his attorney call. Sophie stood apart. She looked at me across the corridor, not with anger. Something quieter. I nodded. She looked away. I had driven myself. On the way home, I took the long way, past the bridge, down past the waterfront. Portland in May. The river was high. The sky was that particular gray blue the city does in spring, the kind that looks overcast, but somehow still lets the light through. I thought about Elaine. I thought about what she would have said. Probably not what I expected. She wasn't sentimental about conflict. She would have said, "You did what had to be done. Now figure out what comes next." What came next was a phone call from a former colleague at the city of Portland. His name is Benson Taft. He'd worked in the permits office for 20 years. We had lunch on a Thursday at a diner on Burnside. Benson said, over coffee, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if I'm overstepping." I told him to ask. He said, "Troy Weston's cabinetry business, before it collapsed. Did you look into how it went under?" I had not looked closely. I told him so. Benson said, "A contractor I know mentioned that Weston Cabinetry pulled permits on a commercial renovation project in 2019, a restaurant built out in the Pearl District. Midway through, a structural element was allegedly damaged during demolition. Weston filed an insurance claim. The claim was large. I said, 'How large?' He said, $65,000 for structural repairs and business interruption. Except the contractor who did the actual repair work billed $40,000. And he was paid directly by the insurance company. I said. And the difference? Benson said. That's what nobody ever followed up on. The business went under before anyone pulled the thread. I pulled the thread. I found the contractor. A man named Russ, semi-retired now, who remembered the job clearly because he thought the claim amount was inflated. Even then, he still had the original invoices. He agreed to cooperate. I called the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation. I had a former colleague there from a professional association. I asked carefully how one would go about reporting suspected insurance fraud on a commercial policy where the business entity no longer existed. She told me. I sent what I had through appropriate channels. I didn't include my name in the submission. I included the documentation. 6 weeks later, I received a letter confirming an open investigation. I was playing chess with Reg when I read it. I set it down on the table between the board and the coffee mugs. He read it upside down. He said, "Is that what I think it is?" I said, "Is that what I think it is?" I said, "It appears so." He moved his bishop. He said, "You've been planning this a while." I said, "I've been documenting this a while." There's a difference. He said, "For you, is there?" I considered that. I said, "Fair point." I filed the civil complaint for recovery of $47,600 in documented loans and additional expenses the following week. Walter filed it in Multnomah County. Both Troy and Sophie were named. Sophie called me that evening. Her voice was level, which surprised me. She said, "Dad, I got the papers." I said, "I know." She said, "I know." She said, "I understand why you're doing it." I said, "Do you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about a lot of things. About how I let things happen. About what I could see and chose not to say anything about. I'm not asking you to take that back. I just wanted you to know I understand." I said, "That means something, Sophie. It doesn't change the debt, but it means something." She said, "I know. She didn't ask me to drop the suit. That was the thing that got to me. Not the apology. The fact that she didn't ask me to drop the suit. The civil hearing was in September. Same courthouse, different courtroom. Judge Boyce again, which seemed to please no one but me. Troy arrived without Sophie. They had separated in July. His new attorney, Fitzgerald Crane, had apparently withdrawn. Was a man who seemed competent, but tired. Troy himself looked diminished. The sport coat fit worse. Sophie sat alone on the other side of the gallery, having agreed through Walter to provide documentary evidence corroborating the loan amounts in exchange for a reduced repayment structure. It was a practical decision. I respected it. Walter presented the case in 40 minutes, every dollar documented, every promise recorded. Troy's attorney argued the expenses were gifts, not loans. Walter produced the text messages in which Troy had explicitly promised repayment. He projected them on the courtroom screen, white text on a gray background, date and timestamp visible. "We'll pay you back within a year, Bernard. You have my word." Troy's word, it turned out, was worth less than the cell plan it traveled on. Judge Boyce reviewed everything for a few minutes. Then he said, "Judgment for plaintiff. $47,600. Plus court costs of $6,800. Plus court costs of $6,800. Payment schedule to be established by the court based on documented income and assets." Troy got $400 per month. Sophie got $350 per month. It would take years. That was fine. In the corridor afterward, Sophie waited until Troy had gone to approach me. She said, "Dad, I'm sorry, not just for what happened in the house. For a long time before that." I said, "I know you are." She said, "I didn't know about the insurance thing. With Troy's company." I said, "I believe you." She said, "Is there a way back? From here?" I looked at my daughter, 36 years old now, looking like her mother around the eyes in a way I hadn't noticed until recently, or hadn't let myself notice. I said, "There's a road. I don't know yet how long it is, but it exists." She nodded. She didn't ask for more than that. Reg came over that Thursday for chess. We sat on the back porch, October, in Portland. The maple in my backyard had started dropping. The leaves fell in that particular slow spiral. "The wind does when it can't make up its mind," he said. So it's done, I said. The legal part is done, he said. And the rest of it? I moved my night. I said, the rest of it takes longer. He studied the board for a while. He moved his rook. He said, you know what I noticed about this whole thing? You never lost your temper. Not once. Not that I saw. I said, I was angry. Plenty of times. He said, that's different from losing your temper. I thought about that. I said, my father was a machinist. He always said a good tool doesn't break under pressure. It bends just enough to absorb it and springs back. Reg smiled. He said, you're calling yourself a tool. I said, you're calling yourself a tool. I said, I'm calling myself well-made. He laughed. It was good to hear that sound on my back porch, in the cooling October air, with the maple doing what maples do, and the light from my kitchen window falling across the board. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone in the position I was in 2 years ago, standing at a kitchen sink on Thanksgiving, washing dishes while someone else accepted compliments for the meal you cooked, listening through the wall the plans being made for your home that didn't include you. Here's what I'd say. You're allowed to be patient. You're allowed to give people time and grace and the benefit of the doubt. Patience is not weakness. Generosity is not weakness. But the moment someone mistakes your patience for permission, the moment they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a resource, you are no longer doing them any favors by continuing. The most compassionate thing you can do for someone who is using you is to stop letting them. I still have the green velvet chair. It's back where Elaine always kept it, in the corner by the east window, where the afternoon light comes through at 4 o'clock and makes everything look like the end of something good. I sit in it sometimes in the evening with a book. The house is quiet. It is mine. The road back with Sophie is long, and we are walking it 1 month at a time. Troy is somewhere I don't think about. The maple is doing what it always does. I was here first. I'll be here last. That, in the end, is the whole of it.